All right, everybody, we're ready to start now. Welcome to Barnes & Noble here at Metro Point in Costa Mesa. My name is Nanette Heiser, and I'm the Community Relations Manager for Barnes & Noble. Tonight, we're really pleased to welcome Judge James P. Gray, who's going to be talking about his new book. But first, I want to tell you a few of his many accomplishments. He's a graduate of UCLA. He went in the Peace Corps to Costa Rica. He was a UCLA graduate from the law school. He was then a criminal defense attorney in the Navy JAG. He was a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles and in private practice for 5 years. He was appointed as a judge in 1983 by Governor Duke Majan. And based on his experiences, Judge Gray believes that the drug laws have failed and has spoken out about this since 1992. He's written this new book, and it's entitled Why Our Drug Laws Have Failed and What You Can Do About It, a Judicial Indictment on the War on Drugs. So we're going to listen to Judge Gray speak, and after he's through speaking, he's going to answer questions, and then after that, he'll be signing books for you. So please welcome Judge James P. Gray. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nanette, and certainly thank you all for coming out and sharing this afternoon with us. In my view, the most critical issue now facing our country is the issue of the drug policy of the United States of America. Let me ask you good folks a question that I ask wherever I go, and that is, how many of you here believe that we in our great country are in better shape today than we were 5 years ago with regard to this critical issue of drug use and abuse and all of the crime and misery that goes with it? Anyone? I see no hands, and that is completely consistent with every other group that I speak with. It can be a religious group, a chamber of commerce, a Rotary Club, service groups. It doesn't matter, political groups. Everyone understands that what we're doing isn't working. But what I have focused on, in addition to showing the harms, unnecessary harms, that this drug prohibition laws have inflicted upon us, is that actually I've gotten an awful lot of hope because we do have options, and not only experimental, because they're not. These options are being utilized all around the world today in mostly Western Europe, where we actually have programs that are working. They are reducing crime, they are reducing misery, they are increasing health, and all that goes with it, increasing employment. So what we need to do is to legitimize the discussion. And in fact, if I could just get that one point across, that it's okay to talk about this subject. It's okay to discuss the fact that we do have options. That's not throwing in the white flag. That's not abandoning our children. That's not unpatriotic. It's none of those things. In fact, to be very honest with you, I speak for law enforcement. I speak for reducing the number of people that will be harmed because of the presence of these drugs in our community. Our program now, our policy now in the United States is the same as it's been since about 1914 with the passage of the Harrison Act. And that is a program of massive prisons. We are still in drug prohibition. We're still in prohibitionary times. We all talk about, well, we finally repealed prohibition. Well, that's not true. We repealed alcohol prohibition. And by the way, notice that crime went down in the United States of America by 65% 1 year after we repealed alcohol prohibition. I am absolutely convinced that we will experience the same phenomenon when we finally come to our senses and repeal drug prohibition. There's no difference between drug prohibition and alcohol prohibition except the subject that's being prohibited. And you know what's happened? We all realize now that alcohol is a serious problem in our community. It is a dangerous, sometimes addicting drug. The secret, of course, is to hold people accountable for their actions, to hold them accountable for what they do. And I, as a judge, I've been a judge now for 17, almost 18 years, I'm pretty good at that. I can hold people accountable for their actions, and I feel very good about that. But you remember Al Capone. Well, Al Capone looks basically like Arthur Murray in comparison to these drug lords we have today. You talk about violence, these folks leave Al Capone in his wake. They are really violent folks. And if you look at it more completely, you look at what we're doing. In our programs today, in our criminal justice approach, we are extremely good at removing the people that are not all that smart, not all that well organized, and not all that violent from the drug trade, leaving this entire incredibly lucrative market to those people who are more intelligent, who are more organized, and who are more violent. And they appreciate it, and they are making billions of dollars a year. And in the meantime, we have filled our prisons with basically the lower level folks. I've been a judge, as Nanette said, for quite a while, about 17, 18 years. Let me share with you something that I saw in my courtroom probably every 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks or so. I was in the juvenile court, abused and neglected children calendar, and it's something that just grabbed me so much, and I'm going to share it with you, and I anticipate that it'll grab you as well. About every 3 or 4 weeks, I would have a woman come into my court who made a serious mistake. She, in effect, hooked up with the wrong boyfriend. She's probably a single parent. Let's say she has 2 children. And she started dating some guy that sells drugs. So he would tell her, well, tell you what, Sarah, I'll give you $400 if you'll take this package across town and give it to Charlie. And basically, of course, she would know that it contained cocaine or something of that kind. So she would. And so she would get arrested and convicted and sentenced to, let's say, 5 years in prison for transporting 3 or 4 ounces of cocaine, which, to be honest with you, that's a lot of cocaine and that's not an unreasonable sentence. Okay, but what happens now? Well, if she has children, she has legally abandoned her children because she's now in prison, there's no father. So what happens to the children? They come to me on the abused and neglected children calendar. So now I have this woman in a prison jumpsuit wearing handcuffs, and I tell her the truth, which is, you know, you're not going to be a part of your children's lives for the next 5 years. And she starts to well up with tears. And then I tell her the direct, bold truth, which is, ma'am, unless you are really fortunate and either have a close personal friend or family member that's both willing and able to take custody of your children, very likely they're going to be adopted by somebody else by the time you get out of prison. And she starts to dissolve in tears. And then if you're taxpayers, you can dissolve in tears as well, because let me tell you what now is going to happen. We taxpayers are going to spend about $25,000 to keep this woman in prison for the first year, and her children will be in a group home. Well, that costs upwards of $5,000 a month per child. That's about $60,000 a year per child, times 2. That's $120,000 of our taxpayer money, plus the $25,000 for the woman. It's about $145,000 of taxpayer money for 1 year, physically to separate a mother from her children. And guess who gets to enforce that colossally stupid rule? I do. And I simply can't do it quietly. It's something that is going on in our society today all of the time. Let me tell you something else. We're here in California. We have the 3 strikes in your outlaws, right? Okay. Are you aware that we have 5 times the number of people sentenced for a 3rd strike, 25 years to life, for marijuana offenses than robbery, rape, and murder combined? 5 times the number of people sentenced for marijuana offenses than robbery, rape, or murder combined. That is what has evolved in this entire situation. So, I believe, in fact, in adopting programs that work. Don't you? Don't you want to do something that works? Can we get rid of these drugs? They're dangerous, no question about it. They're harmful, many times addictive. But we must realize that these drugs are here to stay. You know, I'm sorry to have to tell you, but it's true. Every civilization that has ever existed on the face of the earth has had some form of mind-altering, sometimes addicting drugs in them, except maybe the Eskimos who couldn't grow anything, but now chemistry has come to play. So, if that's the case, and it is, then we must learn to be managers. We must learn that we can't just moralize about this. We can't decree this problem to go away. And so instead of making this phenomenally lucrative market, which brings its own problems in our society, let's recognize that the drugs are here to stay, and then let's manage them. And again, we have options. What are some of those options? Because let's jump to that right now. Let me tell you a program that is going on right now in Switzerland. It started as a pilot program back in about 1994. And in this program, there were 7 cities that adopted the following program. They would have medical clinics governed in effect or run by a medical doctor, a registered nurse, and a social worker. These clinics would go out into the society and try to find the heavy-using drug addicts. And then they would bring them into the clinic, and they'd try to do the same thing that you or I would try to do. They'd try to get them off. They'd try to encourage them to go into drug treatment. But they're not particularly successful. For whatever reason, a lot of these folks do not want or are not able to get off these drugs, at least at that time. So if that's the case, they offer them a program. They, in fact, tell them, if in fact you satisfy 3 criteria, number 1, you are an addict. Number 2, you don't want to get off your drugs for whatever reason at this time. And number 3, you will be crime-free in the future. We will put you on this program. The program means it's called a drug maintenance program, and it's mostly heroin. Dangerous drug, no question about it. They will bring these people into a medical clinic. They will try to determine the level of heroin usage that will maintain them on a kind of a status quo. It won't give them euphoria, it won't give them a rush, but it also won't make them go through withdrawal. It'll just maintain them at their regular level now. They can have those maintenance dosages. They can actually inject at the medical clinics 3 or 4 times a day, whatever it is, and they can get them pretty much for cost, which is about $10 a day. Now, you have to understand, this stuff is dirt cheap to raise, dirt cheap to manufacture. The only reason that it's expensive is because of drug prohibition. So they're able to maintain these folks for a fairly reasonable amount of money each day, and if they can't even pay that, then it's subsidized. Do you know what has happened in those 7 clinics? Well, let me tell you, the Minister of Health of the country of Switzerland held a press conference less than a year after they began. Remember, this was a 3-year pilot program, and he said, you know, I'm not going to wait this long. We're not going to wait the full 3 years. We're going to expand this to 20 cities because it has been so unbelievably successful. You know what we have found? Crime in the neighborhoods surrounding these clinics has noticeably gone down. Well, why would that be? Why does crime go down? Because you take heavy-using addicts and give them access to pharmaceutical-grade heroin. Well, what do addicts in our country, or there, have to do in order to support their habit? Well, they go out and burglarize you or your house or your car. They'll hit you over the head at the ATM when you get money. They'll have check offenses, prostitution, all that sort of stuff. They found that shoplifting was reduced 7-fold in the neighborhoods surrounding these clinics. The merchants were ecstatic. In fact, they were donating money to the clinics to keep them in operation because they were so pleased. So crime went down noticeably. You know what else they found? They found that drug usage in the neighborhoods surrounding these clinics also went down noticeably. Well, why would that be? Oh, come on. What do addicts do in order to support their habits today in our country? Not only burglary, but they also get larger amounts of drugs, and then they go and sell it to you, your family, your children, in order to make money to support their own habits. But they don't do that in Switzerland, because if they're arrested, they're off the program, and they don't need to. So as a result, there's less drugs in the communities and less drugs being used in the communities. A little more sophisticated, too. You know, if there were, say, 20 of these heavy-using addicts on now the clinic, the supplier of those people has lost their market. So they go off looking for other people in other markets, and now, again, you don't bring as much drugs into the community. That's a good thing, isn't it? Boy, I think so. Employment has gone up by 50% of all of the people who are now on this program. They're paying their taxes, they're raising their children, they're not a drain on society, they're actually profitable members of society. And they also found out that about 10% of these people on this program each year now have a bond, a relationship with the doctor. And they say each year, you know, come on, doc, let me off this stuff now. I'm ready. I trust you. We're doing okay. And so because they bring people closer to medical professionals, good things start to happen. We in the United States of America label all of these people as criminals and push them farther away from our doctors. And that causes problems too. So as a result, they have in Switzerland increased this, without waiting the full 3 years, to 20 cities, where it is now a permanent situation in Switzerland. But there were people in Switzerland who said, oh, no, we can't do that. Why? Because it's sending the wrong message to our children. It's that old, tired, hackneyed argument. And you know what people say in Switzerland? Nonsense. Nonsense. The same thing I say here. Why are we sending the wrong message to our children? Because we are taking care of our people, taking them away from crime, increasing their health and their employment and everything else. What I say is, we have some young people in the back. You want to give good drug education to our children? Take them there. Take them to these clinics. What are these people in the clinics going to tell our kids? Oh, sure, go and jam some cocaine up your nose so you too someday can be on a program of this kind? Is that what they're going to say? Absolutely not. What they're going to say is, don't do what I did. You know, somebody gave me a free sample of methamphetamines when I was 12 or 17 or whatever, and I started using, and then I did this and I did that. Don't do what I've done. It's a hard life. It's not a good life. I wouldn't want you or anyone else to get involved with these drugs. That's what these people will tell our kids. It's the best education we could give them. They will see the fundamental truth, which is these drugs are not attractive. These drugs are not a good thing. These drugs bear risks. They will find out that our bodies don't forget. And no matter what the law says, no matter what other people say or otherwise, if we abuse our bodies will not forget. And that's the truth. And that's what we need to do. So they had a plebiscite in Switzerland a couple of years ago. I think it was 1998. Some moralists, some people who said, oh, we're sending the wrong message to our children, got this on the ballot. And they said, we don't want this program to continue. Let's get it off the ballot. You know what happened in Switzerland? More than 70% of the voters in Switzerland voted to keep it. More than 70% of the voters nationwide voted to keep this program. Why? Because it works. And no one can tell me or tell you that Swiss parents love their children any less than we do. That is something that simply isn't true. So they have become practical, and they've become human, and they've realized that this is a human problem, and let's address it from a human standpoint. I was talking earlier to a nice lady here who was talking about her husband and alcohol, which is a very dangerous drug. By the way, and this is a major problem in our society today. Because of that, does anyone think that we again should make alcohol illegal in our country? Of course not. What is the drug that causes the most harm to users in our country and everywhere else today? Cigarettes, hands down. Tobacco kills something on the order of 470,000 people every year. Remember C. Everett Koop, who was the Surgeon General of our country, was giving a talk about this one time. And 470,000 people, it's just a number. It's a big number, but it just didn't live for people. And so what he said was, it is the equivalent of 2 Boeing 747s, the largest civilian aircraft in the world, loaded with people, crashing and burning each day, killing everyone aboard. And that is the number of people that die because they themselves smoke cigarettes. Cigarettes are dangerous. Anybody believe we should make cigarettes illegal in our country today? No. Why? Because then we will have this black market. Then we will have all of these problems that the drug money bring. And these are the problems that we have, in effect, inflicted upon ourselves. We're all aware, to our shame, much less sorrow, to our shame, of this missionary airplane that was shot down in Peru. We've all heard about that. This was not a drug problem, folks. Didn't almost have anything to do with a drug problem. This was a drug money problem. The drug prohibition shot down that missionary plane in Peru, killing that missionary woman and her little daughter. This is what has evolved. Why? Because everyone realizes, just as you have, that what we're doing isn't working. And so they keep trying more and more radical things to make the square peg fit into the round hole, and it doesn't work. So now we're shooting down unarmed planes in Peru. Well, we didn't pull the trigger, but we might as well have. We're the ones that facilitated this to be done. Does that make you proud? Does it make you proud to know that we in the United States of America are #1 in the incarceration of our people? There are more than 2 million people in the United States of America right this minute in prison. We're #1, both in sheer numbers as well as per capita. Now, there are other countries as well that have these problems, but you realize the more you prohibit something, the more you make it attractive, basically from a glamour standpoint and also from a monetary standpoint. We have been totally unsuccessful in trying to repeal the law of supply and demand. And every time you make the sentences more severe, you know, that makes it more attractive monetarily. That brings more people in, and that's a problem. But let's talk about our children, because it's really our children that we are trying to protect. We're pretty much able, all of us here, to make our own decisions and to abide by them and to be accountable for them. But we don't want these drugs to visit our children, right? That's the thing. Let me tell you, there are 4 reasons why our program of drug prohibition has put our children in harm's way, expressly. Number 1, sure, our kids can get alcohol. You know, believe it or not, I was under 21 once. Maybe all of us were too, you know. Did we get alcohol when we were underage? Okay, I confess, yes, I did, on occasion, maybe on 2 occasions. Okay? So it can be done. But talk to our underage kids now, and they will tell you what they tell me, namely, of course I can get alcohol, but I've got to work at it. Takes a little bit of ingenuity, takes a little bit of planning. But it's easier for me to get methamphetamines, marijuana, even cocaine, if I want to, than it is alcohol. Why? Because someone else has a profit motive to give our children these illegal drugs. When was the last time you heard of anyone offering a free sample of alcohol on a high school campus? And the answer is it doesn't happen. But when was the last time that you heard of someone offering a free sample of marijuana or cocaine or methamphetamines or whatever these other drugs are? And regretfully, it happens all the time. So because of drug prohibition, we could not make these drugs more available to our young people than what we're doing now. Why? Because alcohol is regulated by the government, because there are age restrictions, because there are licensing requirements, because they're taxed, because you need licenses to sell alcohol. So there are restrictions. These other drugs are in effect controlled by the mob. And they don't care if your 12-year-old daughter, 15-year-old son uses drugs. Actually, they do care. They want them to because of the money. These drugs are too dangerous, folks, not to control. Let me say that again. These drugs are too dangerous not to control. But any program we establish is going to have some problems. There's no question about it. I acknowledge that no matter what system you put in, we're going to have some problems with it. The trick is to reduce the problems and increase the benefits. And the only way we'll do that is to be managers. So these are things that we simply must understand. Reminds me of a story one time I heard from a man who was on his deathbed. And you know, at the very end of his life, he called his wife to his side and said, well, dear, I know I'm not long for this earth, but before I leave you, I just have to get something off my chest. That for a number of years now, I've been having an affair with such and such a woman that lives across the street. And I don't mean to hurt your feelings, but I think you have a right to know and a right to hear it from me. She thought for a moment. Then she said, that's okay. I know. That's why I poisoned you. Well, in such a similar way, we are poisoning ourselves by the way we have chosen to deal with this very difficult issue. If this issue were easy, we would have solved it already. If this issue were simple, I could have written a 2-page handout instead of a, 278-page book. It isn't easy. It's complicated, it's multifaceted. But I challenge any of you here to come up with any area at all for discussion and not enable me to tell you how we are harming ourselves in that area because of our program of drug prohibition. We have inflicted so much pain upon ourselves, so much damage upon ourselves. We have incarcerated many too many people. You know, there was a person, his name was Jan Nolan. He was a congressman here in the assembly here in California, in a very conservative area, Glendale, California. And he was an arch-conservative fellow. In fact, he bragged that he would vote for any form of legislation that increased the sentence in anything dealing with drugs or almost anything else. And then he was convicted of a political conspiracy, political corruption case, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And you know what happened when it got out? He was really changed. He said, you know, there are too many people in prison that should not be there. I have seen them. They should not be there. And then he went on to make a comment that I thought was really telling. He said, we should reserve our prison space for people that we're afraid of, not people we're mad at. There's a lot of wisdom in that. There's a lot of wisdom in that. We should reserve our prison space for people we're afraid of, not people we're mad at. So these are things that I believe too. I have sentenced people to prison. And you know something? I feel real good about it. I took a tour one time of San Quentin State Prison here. I have never seen so many people that had ball bearings for eyes. You know, they looked at us literally like they're lawful prey. And I was very glad that they are where they are. We're not going to run our police out of business. We're going to need them. I'm a judge. I'm not in fear of my job. But if we were to somehow change away from our program of drug prohibition, if we were somehow to be able to deprofitize these drugs, if we were somehow able to bring these drug users closer to the medical professionals that could help them, instead of labeling them automatic criminals and pushing them farther away, we would then, in the criminal justice system, be able to address society's other problems that are not being addressed now. How many of you have had your house or your car burglarized at any time? Several, right? I have too, my car. What did you do? What did you do? Your car was burglarized. What happened? What'd you do? Call the police. Then what do you need? What happens with the police?
Take a number and that's it.
Take a number. Will they give you a police report? They give you a police report. Okay, most of the time you need it. Why? Why do you need the police report?
For your insurance?
For your insurance. That's right. The police report is not used to investigate the burglary, is it? Why? Because we don't have the money. Because we don't have the resources. Because we're spending all of these resources on drug cases. On drug cases. The secret is hold people accountable for their actions. If somebody burglarizes your house or your car, I don't care if it's to buy money, or excuse me, to buy a new stereo or to get drugs. Doesn't matter to me. That's an offense, and that person should be prosecuted. Right? Boy, I believe that. But it makes as much sense to prosecute this guy, this actor, Robert Downey Jr., in my mind, as it would have to prosecute Betty Ford for her alcohol abuse. Makes as much sense to prosecute Robert Downey Jr. for his drug abuse as it would have to prosecute Betty Ford for her alcohol abuse. Is it really any different? This is a disease. I don't want this disease. I don't want you folks to have this disease. But if you get it and you have that problem, prison doesn't help. Prison is counterproductive. Prison is a waste of resources unless by your actions you're causing harm to others or threatening causing harm to others. I used to say this also about this very gifted baseball player, Darryl Strawberry. You've heard of him. I used to say that too. But then he was convicted of driving a motor vehicle under, I think it was cocaine, and he was sentenced to jail. And you know what I say to that? The way it works, namely to hold people accountable for what they do. And we talk about that in the book really quite a bit. Are you aware, though, also in my book, I should have changed the chapter instead of talking about a loss of civil liberties protections. I should have changed it to Where's Paul Revere? If I were to write the book over, that's what I would call it. Because we have had a larger loss of our civil liberties protections because of the war on drugs than anything in the history of the United States of America. And that is a catastrophe. Why? Because judges are human. You know, they realize too that we're having a problem in this area. And you know, okay, here's this case where they've seized another half-ton of cocaine or whatever it happens to be. And I know it wasn't quite within the guidelines that were in effect at the time, but gosh, that's a lot of cocaine, and we have such a problem in our community. Let's just erode the Fourth Amendment and search and seizure just a little bit in order to do our part, in order to help out. And that's what's happened. And that has been inflicted upon us by the United States Supreme Court roundly ever since the war on drugs began. In my book, I cite the way that the federal law was under the United States Supreme Court cases when I graduated from law school, which was 1971, and then I have cited all United States Supreme Court drug cases to show how that has been eroded between that time and now. And it is a civil liberties catastrophe. And shame on us. We have allowed this to happen. And of course, we're in no better shape today than we were when we started, are we? Why am I doing this? Why? It's certainly not professionally enhancing for a judge to take a position of this kind, and I realize that. But because of my credentials, I'm a pretty conservative guy. I know a lot of people that could testify to that, criminal defendants and others. I hold people accountable for what they do, and I'm proud of that. That's my job, and I do it pretty well. I've never used any of these illegal drugs in my life, and I don't plan on it. You could bless them by the Pope and give them away in a street corner, and I'm not going to jam cocaine up my nose. I'm not going to do it. Are you going to use cocaine if it's legal? Why? Because I just don't want, that's not what I want to do. You know, there's a survey, I'm getting off the point, but it's interesting. There was a survey once that asked people if drugs were legalized, and that's not something I would ever do, by the way. I would strictly control them, regulate them. I would never legalize them. Legalized drugs are like aspirin. You know, anybody can go to any store and buy it. No age restrictions, no restrictions at all except the free market. But at any rate, people were asked if drugs were legalized, would you use them? And people said something in the order of 94%, not me. I don't want to use those things. That's not what I would do. Then they asked the next question, very interesting. If drugs were legalized, do you think your neighbor would use them? And about 70% of the people said yes. It's literally like people are standing in a circle and everyone's pointing to the person on their left, you know, and everybody around the circle points again. So it's not true. In fact, my view is that the problem users are already using this stuff. That it's really the non-problem users that we're really addressing. Because these are problems, and we have to address them as such, holding people accountable for their actions. Now, I'd like to make this a community forum. I'm convinced, I tell you, I am convinced. From my background, from what I have seen, I know full well that any program we would design would be better than what we're doing now. We couldn't do it worse if we tried. But I want to answer your questions. Do you folks have questions? Do you want to talk about anything at all? And I will try to address it, or at least be thinking of questions as we go. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know what percentage of drug-related crime are in our prisons now. How many people? What is the percentage of that?
In Orange County, which is where I do business, and Los Angeles County, where I have a lot of friends and talk, they tell me that about 80% of all felony crime is drug-related crime right now. About half of that 80% is straight drug crime. That means possession with intent to sell, conspiracies with intent to sell, the violence that various drug dealers perpetrate against each other to protect their fiefdoms and the rest. That's about half of that 80%. The other half of the 80% is what I call drug-related crime, which means that it is the crime that people that use drugs perpetrate in order to get the money to buy the more expensive drugs, the burglaries, the purse snatchings, that sort of thing. So no one is going to be able to get rid of crime. I mean, we know that. But if you could deprofitize these drugs, like they did in Switzerland for those heavy users, that program has reduced crime enormously. And again, I said that crime went down in our country. The first year after we finally repealed alcohol prohibition, it went down by 65%. In my book here, I guarantee that crime will go down in the United States of America after 1 year by a minimum of 35%. And I feel very comfortable with that guarantee. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think of the three-strike law, and do you think it should be changed?
What do I think of the three-strike law, and should it be changed? I'm a judge, and I believe that judges should have discretion in order to do the right thing under the law for the particular set of facts as they come in. If we're going to have a three-strikes law, which I don't really disfavor in a lot of ways, the strikes should have to be violent offenses. I already told you that we have 5 times the number in prison in the state of California today because of marijuana offenses than robbery, rape, and murder combined. We are getting the people that are just not very smart. We are getting people that literally are just shoplifting a couple of steaks out of your local market, and that's a third strike. And we're sending people to prison for 25 years to life for shoplifting. Now, people shouldn't shoplift, don't get me wrong, but that is a horrendous response to somebody's actions. Literally, the punishment is not fitting the crime, and we must change that. If only, not for human reasons, I mean, I do it for human reasons, but if only for monetary reasons. You know, we are spending billions and billions of dollars incarcerating nonviolent offenders, and this is a major problem. If you were to take one state prison and not build it, and take that money and put it into things that would help people, boys and girls clubs, recreation centers, mentoring for our kids, after-school care for our kids, health, job skills, anger management, things like this that will actually help people. We're not going to need those prisons. So these are the things. The problem is with all of that is that it doesn't get politicians elected. You know, you give me 6 seconds if I'm running for office. Vote for Gray because I'm going to put those drug dealers in prison and protect our children. How long did it take me to say that? 5, 6 seconds? And I sound tough, right? Makes a great sound bite. But you can't talk about this subject realistically in less than 30 seconds. That's even not enough. And if you try, if you talk reason, if you talk treatment, if you talk education, if you talk about, I mean, really, this midnight basketball came in for such a black eye, and it was too bad, because these kids were on the street corners getting into trouble. We channeled those kids into something constructive and took their energy to something that was constructive. That was a good thing, very inexpensive. But if you talk about that and you're a politician, you sound like a wimp. Try it. Come up with anything in 20 to 30 seconds that talks about this subject realistically, and you'll sound like a wimp. It doesn't sound tough. It doesn't sound forceful. As a result, politicians won't do it. That means, folks, that it's our responsibility to legitimize the discussion. It's our responsibility as voters, as taxpayers, as citizens of this great country to legitimize the discussion, to tell our elected officials that it's okay to talk about this. Just because we discuss drug policy, just because we have questions about our present policy, just in fact because we discuss options or would use options to our present policy does not mean that we condone drug use or abuse. If we get that point across alone, we will allow our politicians to discuss it too. Once they see the votes are in it, then they will get in front. So far, the votes aren't there. The votes are not there for treatment. The votes are there for incarceration, so that's where people go. Sir.
I had a question about the Swiss experience. Do we know what the experience has been in terms of either growth or contraction of use of drugs in the country? Is that kind of information available?
With regard to the Swiss program, to be honest with you, I don't know if overall drug usage has increased or not. It's not in every city. I do know, though, according to the Minister of Health of Switzerland, that drug usage in the neighborhoods surrounding the clinics where they were having these heavy-using folks come in for their treatment went down. As far as nationwide, I just don't know. It stands to reason, but I have to work for a living too. I have not seen that statistic. It certainly stands for reason. Let me ask you a question. I defined what was going on in Switzerland today in this program, the drug maintenance program. Can you think of any colorable reason at all not to put this program into all of our cities in the United States of America? What should keep us from doing that? Anyone? Any reason at all?
Wouldn't the fear be that you'd have growth in drug usage? That's the fear, obviously.
Okay.
That's why I asked
the
question.
fear would be, in effect, we're waving the white flag. Drugs aren't any big deal. I don't care if your 12-year-old daughter buys cocaine in a vending machine across from her junior high school. I mean, all that sort of drivel. It's been shown not to be the case. In fact, the only reason that has any colorable argument at all is it's sending the wrong message to our children, and we've already talked about that. What's the right message? I mean, ask them that. I do that. When someone says, oh, no, you're sending the wrong message to our children, ask them, what's the right message? Go ahead and let them die? Go ahead and have them step on a dirty needle when they're playing in the sandbox? That's the issue. In fact, I started, and you remind me, I talked to you about 4 reasons why we were harming our children, and I only got to the first one, and then I got excited and talked about other things. The one was that, as you'll remember, it's easier for our children to get, our underage children to get these illegal drugs than it is a 6-pack of beer, for example. The issue number 2 really concerns me deeply, as do all of these. Do you know what happens when we continue to ratchet up to increase the penalties for adults in the sale of these drugs? Everyone and their half-sister knows that we treat our juveniles less rigorously in the juvenile criminal justice system than we do for adults. And that's appropriate, and we do. So ask yourself the question, How much risk-taking can you buy for $100 in cash from a 15-year-old boy in the inner city? And the answer is quite a bit, right? Quite a bit. So adults start recruiting our children. And they find out that, again, you can take a lot of risks and pay for that for chump change in the drug business. And you also can find that you can scare these young people and really pretty well control them. And so they start trusting them to act as mules or couriers to carry drugs from one place to another. They use them as lookouts. They use them as gophers. And then you know what they start doing? They use our children to sell small amounts of drugs. And they can trust them to bring the money back to them. And so ask this question. Who does a 15-year-old boy in the inner city sell drugs to? Us? No. 15-year-olds sell drugs to their peers, to their fellow 15, 16, 17, 14-year-olds, right? So by doing this, we are recruiting our children to a lifestyle of drug usage and drug selling because of our laws of drug prohibition. And that is a major problem. Now you understand that soon the lives of these 15, 16-year-olds start really deteriorating. They'll probably start to carry guns, they get into violence, they get into problems, they start using drugs, and pretty soon, if they're not dead, they're medically in really bad shape. But by that time, their position in the drug business is taken over by their recruits. And so the system perpetuates even though the kids die. That is what is being done by drug prohibition, and we must stop it. Yes, ma'am.
Could you go over Proposition 36, and is it working, and the Glen Helen Rehab Center?
Yes.
Is that,
Proposition 36 in California, as you know, was a program that came through mandated by the voters. Again, a healthy plurality of votes. It was more than 60%. Mandating treatment for nonviolent drug users instead of incarceration. And it went into effect as of July 1st of the year 2001, this year. So it's too soon to tell as to how successful it would be because it hasn't been that long. However, the Rand Corporation has a lot of credibility, this group. The Rand Corporation said in June of 1994 that drug treatment is 7 times more effective than incarceration. If you are a taxpayer and you care how your tax money is spent, any of you care? You know, I kind of think so. I do too. You get 7 times more value for your tax dollar in drug treatment, even for heavy users, than you do incarceration. And I think Proposition 36 is going to show that as well. I voted for it. It was not as good as it should have been in my view. We should have earmarked more money for drug testing, which will be done. The politicians will find the money for this because they know they need it. But the secret of all of this is drug courts, which I strongly favor, Proposition 36, which I strongly favor. The secret is to hold people accountable for what they do, not for what they put into their bodies. We have tried that. It doesn't work. It makes the market out of sight. In fact, by the way, on that, does anybody have any idea what the largest cash crop is in the state of California today? Any of you know? Marijuana. Number 2 is corn. Marijuana is the largest cash crop of the state of California today. You want consistency? Well, don't come to the drug war, but if you did, you know what we do is so arrogant, our federal government, so haughty. We certify other foreign governments as to how well they are cooperating with us on our war on drugs. You know that. There's all this big brouhaha of whether we will certify Mexico or certify Colombia and all that sort of stuff that goes with it. Pretty arrogant stuff as far as I'm concerned. We should decertify the state of California because they have not reduced the marijuana being grown in that state. We should keep the state of California from getting any federal money if we were going to be consistent. Agree? I think so. Number 3, though. I had talked about 3 reasons why we're putting our children in harm's way. It's now summertime. What do our kids do? I hope they get a summer job, right? Entry-level jobs, good for them. Great experience, good thing, responsible thing to do. So picture this scenario. We have a kid who's 16, 17, working in a car wash, working in a grocery store, washing windows, whatever he or she would be doing. Comes upon some cohort, some peer, who sells drugs. They know it. The peer, the drug dealer, says, How much money did you bring home last week? Well, you know, I worked 40 hours, I brought home $150. $150? Boy, what a sucker you are. You know, I can make 4 times that much in an afternoon selling drugs. And he's right, and our kids know it. And the war on drugs, drug prohibition, this incredibly lucrative activity, is undercutting the work ethic of our children. And do not de-emphasize that. That is something that we must address. Somehow, if we were to deprofitize these drugs, somehow if we were to bring them back under the law, because today there's no law at all except that enforced by the drug sellers. If we were somehow to bring them back under the law, at least these problems would go away. And fourth, before I forget, how we are putting our children in harm's way. You folks probably heard of this guy named Len Bias. Anyone remember who that was? He was a very gifted basketball player from the University of Maryland, somewhere in the mid-1980s. And as the story went, Len Bias was drafted in the first round by the Boston Celtics. And so he celebrated. You know, his future was secure financially. He was celebrating, obviously, being drafted by the Celtics and the rest. So as the story went, he took cocaine for the first time in his life, had an allergic reaction, and died. Okay? The result on this was amazing. All of the legislators, the congressmen in Washington were outraged by this. And you know what happened? Immediately they again increased the sentences, the minimum sentences for being involved in drugs. But you know what really happened with Len Bias? This isn't told, but it's true. He was on his 3rd allergic convulsion before his quote-unquote friends sought medical attention for him. And they sought medical attention too late. Why? Because they were worried about their own legal health and his legal health. And as a result, they didn't seek medical attention until it was too late and he died. Let me tell you another story. This was in a place called Plano, Texas. Plano is a suburb of Dallas, as I understand it. In 1 year in Plano, Texas, they had 19 or 20 teenagers die of drug overdoses in that town. 1 year, 20 people. And every one had a tale similar to that of Len Bias. They were with other people, friends, cohorts, whomever, and they were having these allergic reactions, but they didn't get medical help until it was too late. So I stand before you and say, why not change our regulations and allow a no ask, no harm policy for anyone taking themselves or anyone else to a medical facility because they've overdosed on drugs? Why not do that? Why not tell our children that your safety is the most important thing? Why not have this no-risk policy? So a friend of mine, his name is Mike Gray, he's no relation to me. He wrote a very good book as well, that I'll give it a plug. It's called Drug Crazy. Very good book, and I recommend you read that as well, right after mine. He went to Plano, Texas. He spoke to the city council there and posed this, saying, you had this problem. Why don't you change your regulations to allow this and then promulgate it so that people will seek medical attention for those in distress? And you know what they said? No. Why? Because it will send the wrong message to our children. That was the reason they gave. What is the right message? Let them die? I tell you, this is putting our children in harm's way because of our programs of drug prohibition. And I simply cannot keep still. Yes, I follow the law. I took an oath of office to do it, and I do it to the very best of my ability, but I don't have to do it quietly. I cannot allow this to continue without calling people's attention to it. I swear to you that if you were a judge sitting in my chair, having seen what I saw, you too would write a book on this. I was a federal prosecutor. In 1978, I held the record in the Central District of California for the largest drug prosecution in that area. 75 kilos of heroin. It's a lot of heroin. It's about 160 pounds or so. Does anyone have any idea what the record today is for the largest drug prosecution in the Central District of California? 18 tons of cocaine in one transaction. There's more drugs out here today than ever before. The cost of a kilo of cocaine or heroin when I was a prosecutor was about $25,000 a kilo. Today it's about half that. It's about $12,000 a kilo. The strength of the drugs when I was prosecuting, somewhere around 20% purity level. You know what it is today? About 80%. It's about 4 times more pure and half the cost. If we can't keep these drugs out of our prison, and we can't, you can get all the drugs you want in prison. It costs you more money, but you can get anything you want. If we can't keep these drugs out of prison, how in heaven's name do we expect to keep them off the streets of our communities and our cities? And the answer is we can't. It's utopian. I believe in a drug-free America. Nonsense. That has led us to where we are today. That will never happen. It has never happened in the history of civilization. It is simply so unattainable that it's harmful even to talk about it. So that's where we are. So again, are there other questions? Yes.
Judge Gray, what is the real cost of these drugs?
What is the real cost of these drugs? These drugs are dirt cheap. And you know something? Even the opium poppy, it'll grow anywhere. There was an editor of Harper's Magazine, I think it was, either Harper's or Atlantic, who actually raised opium poppies. I think he lived in New England somewhere. You know where he got the seeds? From a general catalog. Most of the catalogs you can buy it. I put the name in my book as to what the name of the particular poppies are that can be used. They will grow anywhere. And then he actually took a razor blade and slit them, and he actually made some cocoa tea, that sort of stuff. They'll grow anywhere. They're dirt cheap to grow. The reason why they're expensive is because it's illegal. These people are making billions, with a B, billions of dollars a year at this. We lose more money from our shores because of drug money than anything else except oil. Realize that. If we're worried about our balance of payments issues, we lose more money because of illegal drugs than anything else except oil. Mexico makes more money off illegal drugs from us than they do the exportation of oil. These are things that we don't focus on. Marijuana, they call it a weed. And it is. It'll grow anywhere. It'll grow anywhere. Hemp? Anybody know what hemp is? Any of you? Hemp was a great industrial product. In the colonies, the first laws, the first regulations that were affecting any of these drugs actually required the colonies to grow a certain number of acres of hemp depending on their size. It was used for the sails of old Ironsides, you know, the USS Constitution, made for rope. Gunny sacks, you don't see them much anymore. They were mostly made of jute or hemp. We have absolutely crippled our hemp market. You can use them now in 2x4s. They use them in the grill work for BMWs. You can make lacquer. My wife bought some granola at a local market, local food store that actually has hemp seed in it. It's quite good, quite nutritious, it's supposed to be. These are things, but now we are forced to import hemp from those radical countries, Canada and England, because they have now legalized hemp for their industrial purposes. We haven't. Why? Because we're afraid of a little hole in the dike. Why are we so afraid? Let me tell you. A couple of reasons. Number one is we have all been conditioned by decades of rhetoric to equate these sometimes dangerous drugs with prison. I was raised that way, and most of us were. We need to change our emphasis and change the effect of what we're doing. Remember the story I told you about the person who ended up poisoning her husband? Same deal. But another reason is we have a colossal bureaucracy in our country that is founded and funded by the war on drugs, and they don't want to give it up. There are 2 sitting congressmen in Orange County that are still sitting congressmen. They sat me down one-on-one. They knew what I stood on this, and in their own words, they brought up the subject. They said, Jim, of course you're right, the war on drugs isn't working, and we know that. But if you ever get to Washington, you're going to find out that the situation is even worse than you think, because every federal agency we have gets extra money to fight the war on drugs. And it's not just the big ones and the open ones. You know, obviously the Bureau of Customs, the DEA, the Department of State, all of the military. I mean, it's pretty obvious that they get a lot of funding to fight the war on drugs. But it's the little ones, too. It's the Bureau of Land Management. It's the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's the Department of Agriculture. All of these organizations get extra millions and tens of millions of dollars to fight the war on drugs, and they're addicted to the drug money. So it's up to us as taxpayers and voters to say, no, No more. And finally, I can come up with a comment. It was about in July of the year 2000 that now the former drug czar, General McCaffrey, came to Orange County. And he was proud of, touting, bragging, that his budget alone, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, had its budget increased last fiscal year from $17.8 billion to $19.2 billion for the year. Asking someone like General McCaffrey if he wants to continue with the status quo is basically like asking a barber if you need a haircut. Of course you do, because he gets money by this. And that's something that you just have to understand. How much money is $19.2 billion, folks? Think, it's now been jettisoned, but United Airlines had a bid in to buy U.S. Air. Do you know what the purchase price was? $4.6 billion. That means that General McCaffrey, our drug czar, on his budget alone could buy 4 major airlines every year and have $800 million or so left over. That is a lot of money, and that perpetuates this status quo. Are there other questions? Anything that, yes, ma'am?
You make the most compelling position in your book that I probably have ever read. I mean, it's like such a tight case, but the question is, you read it and you get so frustrated because if that's the facts, what can somebody like myself do about it?
That is a question that's very difficult to answer in some ways, but I bring you hope. First of all, in the back, in Appendix A of my book, I have a drug policy resolution. I ask that people make copies of it and send it to all of their elected officials. Don't send it to officials that you can't vote for because it won't make any difference. But you can send it to your city council, to your mayors, to your board of supervisors, your legislators, congresspeople, senators, and the rest. It says that what we're doing isn't working. It says that we should have a neutral commission appointed as openly as possible, made up of people from all walks of life, certainly law enforcement and the clergy and treatment officials and recovering addicts and all of the rest. And as openly as possible, look into what we have done in the past that has worked and what we have done in the past that has not worked. And the same thing worldwide. Find out what other people have done that have both worked and not worked. And by doing that, you'd be shocked at the amount of impact that your letter will have upon your elected officials. They count. Otherwise, too, at the end of my book, you know, it's entitled, Why Our Drug Laws Have Failed and What We Can Do About It. The last chapter is what we can do about it. And I go through and list numbers of things that we really are able to do. One of them is, for heaven's sake, let's write our Congress people and stop subsidizing tobacco. I mean, talk about a bad message. And that is so counterproductive that we simply should stop it. Another, by the way, is selling alcohol at service stations. Talk about a mixed message. You know, get in your car and drink this beer and drive. That should not happen, in my view. I know there's a major amount of money to subsidize the continuation of that, but that's a message we should not be sending. There are numbers and numbers of other specific things that we can do. But mostly, we can vote. We can tell our elected officials that unless you yourself start talking about options, start talking about this subject realistically, you're not going to be my elected mayor anymore. You talk about, and you can start at a lower level. Needle exchange programs. Needle exchange programs are probably the easiest, most straightforward medical system that we can discuss. It means that you exchange a dirty needle for a clean one, no money changes hands, and no questions are asked. You know what has happened? There have been studies in New Haven, Connecticut, and San Francisco, and several others in our country, plus around the world, that show that needle exchange programs do not increase drug usage, but they have an enormously positive effect upon AIDS. That, in effect, it reduces the incidence of AIDS by about 50%. 50%. Holland. I haven't talked about Holland. They have a program of decriminalization. Again, these terms mean something. Decriminalization means it's still illegal to buy, use, possess any of these drugs in Holland. However, as long as people stay within generally very well-known guidelines with regard to quality and quantity, the police are instructed in writing not to arrest you, not to cause you any trouble. They combine that, though, with a program of what they call harm reduction. Understanding the drugs are harmful, which they truly are, they try to reduce the harm that can and will be caused from their presence in our communities. And one thing they have done is install programs of needle exchange in their cities. And they have seen their usage, their incidence of AIDS decrease a lot. They began in the middle 80s, I believe, 1980s, when they found that 8% of all people that used illegal injectable drugs were HIV positive. Because, you get them from dirty needles. We all know that. So they instituted this program of needle exchange in their cities. And within 3 years, you know what they found? The incidence of AIDS of injectable drug users went down from 8% to 4%. That was pretty good, wasn't it? That was a positive thing. They keep it up. Costs nothing. You know where by the way, in order to have a program of needle exchange, it's a good idea to have it in a lighted place, in a safe place, and in a place that's open 24 hours a day. Where would that be? Hospital is a good choice. Also police offices, police stations. That's where most of them are. They're in police stations. They're safe. They're open 24 hours a day. They're illuminated, right? That's what they have found in Holland. It works pretty well. Are you interested in a crime? This absolutely tears me apart. I told you that in Holland, before they began this program, 8% of people that used injectable illegal drugs were HIV positive. That was reduced to 4%. Do you know what percentage of drug users of illegal injectable drugs in the United States of America is being HIV positive? 35%. 35% of all people, it is estimated, in our great country who use illegal injectable drugs are HIV positive. And I don't care what we think about drug users. You can call them lazy, you can call them moral degenerates, you certainly can call them criminals, but they do not deserve to die of AIDS. And, of course, to transmit that on to their sexual partners, if they're a woman and they get pregnant, onto their fetus. This is absolutely unconscionable. I am just very disturbed that this is going on in our country. Needle exchange programs work. You talk about what we can do. You demand from your supervisors, your city council people, that they institute programs of needle exchange in their community. Sir.
Hepatitis C is absolutely running rampant.
Hepatitis C. Yeah. Hepatitis B and hepatitis C. Hepatitis C, by the way, has no cure, and it is also gained from the dirty needles. If you share a needle with somebody that has hepatitis C, your odds are unacceptably high that you will get it too. There's no cure for it. This is an upcoming epidemic, and you're absolutely right. It really terrifies me. So that's where we are. Yes, sir.
When somebody who used drugs go to jail and stay there for a few weeks or whatever, they cannot use drugs, and basically they have a forced withdrawal. They are ready to kind of like come back to life and get rehabilitated. There is some program in between the jail system and so he can go back to normal.
What you say is that someone is put in jail for using drugs, which of course happens lots. You say that they can't get drugs in jail, and of course that's not true. I do believe, however, that people that are addicted physiologically to drugs probably cannot continue to maintain that physiological addiction because the drugs are too expensive in prison. So I agree with you that when people get out of jail or prison, if they've been there for 30 days or longer, they're probably not physiologically addicted to the drugs. However, they go back to the same system that they started, their same society, the same folks, the same lifestyle, and immediately recontinue their use of drugs. It's funny, because having been doing this now since April of 1992, speaking publicly about it, I've kind of become a clearinghouse in a lot of ways for different people and their letters and their stories. There was one woman I received this letter quite a while ago, but it just really, I can't forget it. She wrote me a letter, "Dear Judge Gray, I live in Leisure World," which is down south of here, a retirement community, and I am 82 years old, and I'm an activist, she said. And in fact, but my issue is nuclear power, and that I have been arrested several occasions for my views. And she must be really quite a lady, I think. But she said, you ought to understand, when I was in jail, there were all these women that were there charged with, convicted of drug offenses. And all they could talk about was barely waiting to be able to get out of jail to go back to their drugs again. And then, something else? I was first of all thinking, what a waste of time. I mean, what are we doing this for? It isn't deterring anybody. It isn't stopping anything. But you know something else, she said? I couldn't even take a shower because all of these women were in the shower stalls smoking marijuana and the guards didn't seem to care. So that's what's really happening here. It really isn't making any profitable difference. Isn't there something we can do instead, I think was part of your question. And the answer is absolutely. You know, other than hold people accountable for their actions. Again, those are offenses. Bring them to me. If the people happen to be drug addicted, I can coerce them into treatment. But you know, we have conservatively about 20 million people in our country that are estimated to use some form of illegal drug on a regular basis. We have 2 million people in our prisons today, and our prisons are at 180% occupancy. So even if someone thought it was a good idea to put those 20 million people in prison, how could we do it? So instead, let's focus our scarce resources upon people whose conduct cause harm. Don't you think? And then you don't have to support all of this undercover narcotics work and all of this dangerous stuff and everything else, because if people are just determined as adults to get this garbage, then let them. If they're going to get them anyway, at least tax it, deprofitize it, take the glamour out, never advertise it, which was a major mistake I think we made in alcohol prohibition when it was repealed. I mean, advertising pushes this stuff. No advertising ever. But if they're just downright determined to get it, let them. And then hold them accountable for what they do. And use our drug courts and our Proposition 36 resources to hold the problem users accountable. They're going to drive under the influence of marijuana or alcohol or anything else. That's a crime. Bring them to me. If they're going to hit someone over the head with a pool cue, by the way, I don't care if they're drinking alcohol or not. That's still a crime. If they happen to be alcoholic, bring them to me, and I will take them off alcohol. I can do that as a condition of probation. I've done it very successfully here in Orange County with regard to alcohol. But remember the secret. Alcohol does not have to be illegal in order to hold people accountable for their conduct. So that's where we're going. There are better ways. I know we can find them. I think I ought to start wrapping this up, and if any one of you would like me to sign some of your books, I would be honored to have you read them. Please, though, don't buy a book unless you will read it. I'm not trying to sell money or sell books or otherwise here. I want this discussion to go forward. I want to legitimize this discussion. Maybe I can take one more question, and then I will talk to you individually. Yes, ma'am.
I think what you're trying to sell is responsibility for the whole country. It's not just the addict's responsibility to control his or herself, but it's, as you said, it's our responsibility, because I'm a former addict, and I hesitated before saying this, but I was a heroin addict in New York City. When I came here, I never used it anymore, and I've been here 30 years. But there were no treatment programs. I probably don't look like anybody's conception of an addict, and I really hesitated before I say anything because I work next door here, and I'm in here all the time, and nobody knows this. But it's really appalling. We had no treatment programs in New York when I was there. They were very difficult to get into. I was fortunate to be around before the era of AIDS, or I probably would have been a victim. My children suffered because I was an addict and because I was not able to get the proper treatment when I did want to get off. Both my husband and myself, when we came here, my husband continued using, he started using alcohol, which was not his drug of choice. He was a brilliant man, and we have had marvelous children, but they've suffered for it. And there was no need to have this illegal. We need a sense of gentleness in our society. The media, the music, touts drugs, touts violence, and I'm not saying to restrict the media or restrict the records, the record companies or what they say, but it's just insane, in my opinion, to make drugs illegal and a criminal offense when kids are using them and when they're caught using them, then to turn them into criminals, because you know our jails are great universities for criminal activities.
We have in our state of California, and I applaud what you're saying, and I welcome you here and thank you for being here. Since 1984, we in the state of California have built, up until 1984, we in the state of California had built 13 state prisons throughout our history. Since that time, we've built an additional 17, making a total of 31. They are now overcrowded. In that same amount of time, we have only built one university, and I think that is to our shame. We've already had the Rand Corporation that talks about treatment being far more effective, pound for pound, money for money, than incarceration. We have made an incredibly lucrative market, and it doesn't stop our people, because they're illegal, it doesn't stop them from using these things. Let's focus on what works. There's nothing in my background, by the way. You know, I'm a judge. I've kept my eyes open. I've read a lot. I've talked a lot. I've listened a lot. But there's nothing that formally in my background that assists me in setting up drug policy programs. But if you just open your eyes and address what works, I have concluded that there are 4 things that work. Education works. You show me a problem, and I will tell you that education is part of the big solution for that problem. Talk about cigarettes. You know, we are making serious progress today with regard to weaning people off cigarettes or reducing their consumption of cigarettes. Why? By making it illegal? No, but by showing them what is going on, what the secrets are, what the health is, and we are having people decline using cigarettes in our society today. That's a good thing. Number 2, treatment and prevention really do help. You know, we use a system of prevention and treatment for our automobiles, for our airplanes, for our bodies, and it works with regard to drug treatment as well. Number 3, we need to have positive incentives. Today, there are so many incentives to, in effect, push people into the sale and the usage of drugs. Let's turn those around. Do not underestimate the profit motive. We need to put the motives where it will result in socially acceptable conduct. And of course, number 4 is individual accountability. And again, that's what you're talking about. We must have a system that increases responsibility for our own actions. That's what we should do in the criminal justice system. Let's get away from all of this undercover narcotics stuff and all of the snitches and all of the wiretaps and all of the losses of our civil liberties and everything else, and go back to what works. Individual responsibility does that. I very much appreciate your being here today. I look forward to talking with you individually if you have other questions. I would love you to be able to buy and read my book. I've spent a lot of time on this. I document everything I say. Anytime that there's a comment in here of substance, there is a footnote that gives the justification for it from wherever source. I believe that everything I have in here is accurate. There are a lot of other stories that I heard, but I couldn't justify them, so I omitted them. It is called Why Our Drug Laws Have Failed and What We Can Do About It, a judicial indictment of the war on drugs. It is that. It's not just me. It's not just Judge Gray saying that this isn't working. There are an additional 40 judges from around the country that contribute their thoughts, some of them for the first time, as to why what we're doing isn't working from their perspective. It is, the evidence is everywhere. It's simply time for us to examine the evidence, look at it, take it to heart, and tell our politicians that it's okay to discuss this. Just because we discuss drug policy does not mean we condone drug use and drug abuse, and we will vote out of office any elected official that doesn't at least have an honest appraisal of this system. So I thank you so much. I'm going to leave you with a quick story. The first one worked. And this one is, you know, I heard a man who said, when my grandmother turned 72 years of age, she started walking 5 miles a day. Now she's 77 and we haven't the faintest idea where she is. Well, in such a similar way, for whatever reason, we passed our laws of drug prohibition. And I suggest to you all that we have no idea where these laws have taken us. It's time that we openly assess it, look at it, and then, by thunder, change it. Thank you for helping us do that. I very much appreciate your sharing this time with us. Thank you all.